Amen.
Maybe seated, unless you want to stand the whole time. Summer of 2005, my wife and I were interning at a church that was on the east side of Buffalo in a declining suburb. And our internships were a major part of our ministry degrees. And so I worked directly with the senior pastor, and my wife, who's amazing with children, worked in the children's ministry. Now, this was a smaller church, and it was filled with a very wide blend of people. A wide blend of people from all walks of life. And one of the things that attracted me to these people was their enormous heart for broken people. Absolutely fascinated by it. They were people on the margins, people wrestling with poverty, people who felt like the church would collapse if they ever stepped foot in it. And it was during my time at this church that I struck up a friendship with a woman named Robin. And Robin was in her mid-50s, and she was as real as they come. And as I got to know Robin, I got to know more of her story. And I got to know that Robin had lived life at its rawest. She experienced divorce. She experienced her husband cheating on her. She experienced abuse and a relationship with her son that she was desperately trying to repair. And to top it all off, Robin suffered with a condition known as fibromyalgia. And fibromyalgia just causes extreme pain in the muscles and all sorts of muscle fatigue. And what's interesting is that Robin flew underneath the radar at this church. There were lots of dominant, very loud personalities in our church. However, Robin just kind of was frequently overlooked. What amazed me about Robin is that she knew people better than anyone else in that church. She knew their struggles, she knew their fears, their concerns, their hang-ups. Now, Robin was a woman of deep prayer. And what I would often see Robin doing during church service, even after services, and I found out even during the week, is she would seek out the people she knew were struggling. And she would take the time to genuinely pray with them. Robin never spouted cliches, ever. Sometimes she just sat with you and sighed. And so Robin would bring people in prayer right into the presence of the God of Jesus to remind them that the God of Jesus is the only one that saves.
Amen.
Is the only one that heals. Thursday nights, Robin led a recovery group in the basement of the church. And she invited me as this 20-something intern to join her. And so I come to that meeting, and I'm feeling extremely awkward, and I'm feeling like, what in the world do I have to give to any of these people sitting in this group? And so I sit there, and people are slowly entering the basement of the church, and as each come in, my out-of-place meter skyrocketed. Okay, so then there are 15 people that have 15 or so people that have come into the basement. And I start to notice something. I start to watch Robin walk around to each of them to say hello. Sometimes she greeted them, and sometimes she sat right next to them, asked them how they were doing, and then she ended up praying with them. Now, some of them she simply greeted, but then it was like she knew their stories inside and out, and she knew as soon as they came into that basement what was going on. So the meeting begins, and people are giving updates about what's going on in their life. And some of them are openly confessing things. I mean, they are openly sharing things. They're confessing. Some are talking of victories, some are talking of extreme failures, and at some points the group laughs, and at other points the entire group is crying for one another. And it's as I'm sitting there feeling terribly out of place that I realize that I'm just as much a part of this group as everyone else that is there. The only difference between me and them is that they have the courage to admit their brokenness to one another. They have the courage to admit, I'm not in control. And they have the courage to admit their lostness. Yes, that's a word. I may have made it up, but it's a word. They have the courage to admit their lostness and their full reliance on Christ for mercy and their full reliance on Christ for strength. That is the only difference between me and them, their courage. Now, Jesus spoke a lot about lostness. And on one occasion, like many occasions, Jesus is amongst tax collectors and sinners, who in first century Israel would have been labeled lost. So Jesus is among them. And what he does is he then launches into 3 parables, back to back to back. There's no choppiness, it's back to back to back parables. And he begins with this parable. And if you want to follow along, it's in Luke chapter 15. Luke 15. Starting with verse 1. Jesus says, suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders, goes home, and then he calls the neighborhood together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep. Now after sharing this, Jesus then shifts course and he says this, I tell you that in the same way there will be rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 persons who don't need to repent.
Say it again.
Now, say
it again.
Now, the story ends. And what typically happens is we try to chop things up in the scriptures. We like it that way. And in your Bibles, you have these nice, cute headings for these different stories. And sometimes those headings don't do justice to the scriptures. Because Jesus then immediately tells another story. And this is the next story he tells, the next parable. Suppose a woman has 10 coins and she loses one. And Jesus says, doesn't this woman light a lamp and sweep the house and search all over until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors, and she says, rejoice with me. I have found my lost coin. And Jesus, just like he did with that first parable, shifts course and he says, in the same way, I tell you that there is rejoicing in the presence of angels of God over one sinner who repents. Now, before we engage with the third and final story that many of us may be familiar with, Jesus, we have to understand something about parables. Parables were a form, they were a style of teaching that are very foreign to us in 21st century America. We would have no idea what to do with parables. In fact, we probably would have been upset. Parables were one of the dominant forms of teachings in the first century amongst the rabbis. And parables were meant to evoke a response. There was a response that came forth while you were listening. Parables lowered your defenses. If I would sit up here and say point 1, point 2, point 3, you'd be bored out of your mind. If I told you a story, it was a good one, you would lean in and want to know where this thing's heading. See, the rub is that parables hardly had black and white, clear-cut meanings and endings. Oftentimes, parables led you into gray areas. Parables oftentimes placed you in these gray areas, and the rabbis would leave it up to the listener to figure out what the story meant and all the implications that it had for their lives. You would say, just give me it. Give me the info. Give me the fact. And Jesus would just believe it. And it would terribly disturb you. Now, when speaking of rabbis in their parables, there is one Middle Eastern proverb that says this: the great teacher never offers his students a basket of cucumbers. Instead, he places a peppercorn under the tongue. Because cucumbers and peppercorns go together, correct?
All day.
Yes, they do. Now, peppercorns burn. And I asked my wife, I said, man, I want to bring someone up here and put a peppercorn underneath their tongue and just see what happens. And guess what she said?
Do it.
No. No. When I was in Michigan, my brother, my pastor, he took a light bulb and he wanted to illustrate something breaking. And he took this light bulb in his bare hand. I love this man. And he broke it. And as mad as he broke it, I told the person sitting next to me, he just cut his hand. And he did. So, I am not doing the peppercorn. Now, peppercorns would burn. And non-processed peppercorns in first century Israel would be a tad overwhelming in the mouth, especially underneath the tongue. In the words of my daughter, that would be very spicy. But this is how parables function. This is how Jesus' parables function. Jesus was all about the spiciness. Jesus loved to just leave a story and to let people wrestle with it. Now, we tell stories, but we tell them very differently, don't we? Especially stories that teach. We tell the story, and then we put words to the lesson. This is what this means. This is the takeaway. In the culture that we have been raised, knowledge or truth is something that is just given to you up front. You don't sometimes have to work for it. And we're just given the information. Here's the fact, number 1, number 2, number 3. You have all heard sermons with 3 points. Just give me the information. Yet, in Jewish consciousness, truth was meant to be experienced, because if truth was actually engaged with, what it would do is it would shift your heart. It would transform you. What's more powerful? Someone giving you information, or you actually having to think through it? Having to think through it. You would own that truth. Now, Jesus first tells a story about a lost sheep that is found, and then he tells an interesting story about a woman who loses a coin. And in both stories, what you need to key in on is the fact that Jesus shifts each story, and he talks about all of heaven and God rejoicing over one sinner who repents. And at this point, what we're all tempted to do is this. Oh, I get it. We're the lost sheep, and Jesus has found me. Oh, we're like the lost coin, and Jesus has found me. Here's the deal. With Jesus' teachings, don't ever assume. Ever. Now, this isn't wrong. It isn't wrong to say Jesus had these clever illustrations, but there is tons more going on here. How did we get from the lost sheep who was found to repentance? How? That's a big jump. Who had to repent? The sheep? How about the woman with the lost coin? Who sinned? The woman? Did the coin need to repent? Jesus has left pieces out of these parables, because what he's doing is he's saying, follow along very close, because I'm about to lay the full hand on the table. Now, there's a bombshell about to go off. And the bombshell goes off when Jesus shares this third story that we're all familiar with, and I guarantee that we've all interpreted it one way, and we've never seen it the way that Jesus actually meant for it to be heard. There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger son looked his father in the face, and he said, I am so sick of living here. I am so sick of living underneath your roof. I know the inheritance I'm going to get. I can't wait till you die, so give it to me now, because I want out. And so the father sells a part of his land, which would have been his inheritance, and he gives the younger son what he wants. Instead of the father taking a typical first century patriarchal role and getting enraged with his son, he says, okay, here it is. And the younger son takes it and he leaves and he starts partying, and he goes off to what is called the open country. He gets as far away as he can, and he starts partying. He starts getting smashed. He starts buying evenings with prostitutes. He's blowing money on everything and anything until he's flat broke. And when he's broke, he needs a job. And so he goes to a man who raised livestock, and he begs him for a job. And this guy then sends the younger son to do a job that no one wanted to do: feed pigs. And so the man, the younger son, slops foul, rotten food into a trough every day. He shovels what is known as pig crap every single day. And every day he does it, he is gagging and he is throwing up. And now, after another day's work, we see him sitting in the pig crap. We see him sitting in the pig feces, is the better technical word. His hands are on his face. He's got puke all over his shirt, and he's crying. And he's thinking about home. He's thinking about how good he had it. He's thinking about his father, his family. He's thinking about that, and he decides, I'm just going to go home and I'm going to beg my dad just to be a servant. You translate that word servant in first century, in the first century Greek, it actually means slave. He's going to beg to simply be a slave because those pigs have more to eat than he does right now. And so he rehearses this apologetic speech, and the younger son heads for home, and he comes up over the hill, and his father is out working in the field, and he suddenly sees his son come over the horizon, and what he does is he picks up his tunic, embarrassing himself. Patriarchal fathers in the Jewish culture, you would never bare your legs, and so he picks it up and he runs full bore and he hits his son and he throws his arms around him and he places his hand on the back of his head and his son just weeps on his shoulder and the father weeps right along with him. And then the son pulls back and he starts giving him the rehearsed speech. And guess what the father does? He cuts him off. He doesn't want to hear it. And what he does is he calls to his servants and he says, my son is home. Bring him the best robe. Slaughter the fattened calf, because now it's time to party. Round up the neighborhood and start cranking the music. Now typically, we've said, wow, fascinating. But we've left that story there. And what we don't realize is that this is a story about how many sons? 2. So the party starts cranking. And the music is blasting. And the neighbors are calling because it's past that 10 o'clock noise ordinance. And the older son comes home from a day's work. And he hears all the racket. And he asks one of the servants, what the heck is going on? And the servant says, your brother is home. And they are partying. And that older brother gets furious. He's enraged. And the text says that he stands outside. He stands outside the house, and then the father comes out to him, begging him to come back inside. And the older son doesn't want to hear it. And he points his finger in his father's face and he says, my brother spit in your face. He practically told you to die. I've busted my rear end for you for years. Anything you ever wanted done, I did it, and I've received nothing. You have given me nothing. I've never disobeyed you. Are you kidding me? He blows everything, and you throw him a party? Now, with tears, the father looks into his older son's face, and he says, my son, you have always been with me. And you have always known that all I have is yours. You've never had to earn it. You don't understand. My son, your brother, was gone. We thought he was dead. Now he's back. When Jesus tells this third parable, what he's done is he's laid his whole hand onto the table. Up until this point, with those first 2 parables, he's only shown a few cards. Now, he's got the full hand on the table. Read it and weep, because everything Jesus' audience believed about lostness, everything we believed about lostness, has been totally turned upside down. Back when I was interning with my wife at this church on the east side of Buffalo, I spent one evening with Robin and her recovery group. One simple evening. And I experienced the real voices of real people confessing real failures, real sins, grieving, celebrating their victories, and extending grace to one another. And as all this happened in front of me, I cannot tell you how alive I felt inside. I mean, when I witnessed this, people just ripping it wide open and confessing their weaknesses and placing their trust and saying, Christ, I am fully reliant on you and your saving grace. Guess what person felt more lost than anyone else in that room? Me. I would argue that those individuals were more found. They were more found than me. I would argue that those individuals in that group were more found than many of us here. What's interesting is that the church has long referred to this story as the story of the prodigal son. Jesus never gave these parable titles. And the title of this parable is the prodigal son. No, he just told the story. And if you don't chop them up, what you'll discover as you look at all three of them in succession is that he is now redefining lostness, but he is aiming it at people who believe they've already been found. He's aiming it at people who think everything is okay. He's aiming it at people, he is aiming it at older brothers. I don't know if you know this, but this world, especially this country, full of older brothers. Churches are full of older brothers. Full of them. They live as if they've learned something, as if they've got it all nailed down, as if they've got it all figured out. They applaud their religious activities, their church going, their rigorous attendance. They applaud their prayer life. They applaud all their right beliefs and their right doctrine and their right political views. But within God's reality, it isn't about earning anything. It isn't about self-sufficiency. It isn't about having everything correct. It isn't about right beliefs and right political views or rigorous church attendance. To live God's reality, to live as one truly found, is to constantly throw oneself at God's mercy and say, I cannot do this without you. Is to say, I am a broken individual, and without you, I am totally lost. It is not about self-sufficiency. It is not about earning anything. It is not about being religious. It is about constantly throwing oneself at God's mercy and saying, I need your strength. And this is exactly what the younger brother did. This is exactly what you don't have to tell the younger brother types that they're lost. They know it. But older brothers don't know it. They believe they're found. They believe they've earned it. They believe they're self-sufficient. Have you ever thought about all the times where you think you got it all nailed down, and then all of a sudden the rug gets pulled out from underneath you, and you're suddenly left there feeling like, what in the world? Older brother syndrome. Henry Nouwen, one of my favorite authors, he wrote a book called The Return of the Prodigal Son. Obviously, he's talking about the parable of the two sons. And in this book is a collection of things he had learned by simply going to a museum in Europe and simply gazing at a painting that was painted by a man named Rembrandt. And it was a painting called The Return of the Prodigal Son. And so Henry Nouwen went to this museum, and what he did was very awkward. He sat in a chair and he simply looked at this painting. And of course the guard looks on and says, good Lord, what are you doing? So he gazes at this painting, he's meditating on it, he's thinking about it, and this book is a collection of all his insights that he gained by simply looking at this painting. This is Rembrandt's painting right here. This is the painting. And Nouwen, in the book, talks at length about how he sees himself in the younger son. Sure. But then he talks about something else. He identifies more with the older brother, the one who simply stands by and watches the lost son. And I would say this, we all have shades of the younger brother, all of us. But if you would actually get down to the core of us, we have more shades of the older brother, because we've all bit this lie that we are self-sufficient. We applaud our religious activities, we applaud our right beliefs, our right doctrines, our right political views, and we just kind of believe that we can do this all alone. And some people sitting in this church would say, no, I believe in Jesus. But when we watch our actions, it would tell something very, very different. And in God's world, self-sufficiency, earning something, is not how it works. In God's world, that's not how it works. It's not how it works. It's not about earning. It's not about self-sufficiency. It's not about how rigorous and awesome your prayer life is, or how much you read the Bible, or how much you attend church. It's about throwing yourself at the mercy of Christ every day and saying, I'm broken, and without you, I cannot continue on.
Amen.
So let's just spend some time in silence. This is about